So I hope you can hear me. So I wanted to give people a few moments before we started, but I think everybody who is coming is probably here. So let's go ahead and get started. So I wanted to go over a bit, just in case you've never been to an ACWS webinar, how this will work. I'm going to just go through the material real quick. In this case, we're talking about permissions and security groups in Outcome Tracker. I'm going to go through the material really quickly, and if I will pause at certain places to see if you have any questions, but you are muted. So if you have a question, you can either hold your hand, raise your hand, which you can do in the GoToWebinar dialog box. You can raise your hand, or you can ask a question in the little questions box that's on that dialog box as well. So you can do either of those things. You can use the GoToWebinar interface to raise your hand or ask a question. And when I get to a little break to pause, I will try to answer your question as best as I can. And I may unmute you to ask for more specifics. I may not, but largely you will be muted during this, so I cannot hear you. And that is just because if I unmute everybody, it can get really confusing with everybody speaking at once, and often there's feedback, which can make it a really unpleasant experience. So we just keep everybody muted while I go through the information. If you have questions, just let me know via those two means, raising your hand or using the question interface. So that's it. That's all you need to know. I think we can get started. I'm going to share my screen here. And hopefully you can see my screen. I'm just on Outcome Tracker. And right away, I have something that you should know, is that right now in VistaShare, you cannot use Google Chrome to edit user information, to edit security groups or permissions. And that is because there was an update with Google Chrome that made it incompatible with VistaShare's interface. And VistaShare is working on that right now. But in the meantime, you will have to use either Firefox or Edge. I believe also works. I haven't tried it, but Firefox definitely works. So, and Firefox is the preferred browser for VistaShare, but this is the first time that I've ever experienced something actually not working on Google Chrome that works in Firefox, because my preferred personal browser is actually Chrome. But if you want to edit your security groups and permissions, you cannot use Google Chrome at this time to do it. You have to use Firefox or Edge. So that's just something to keep in mind if you are having difficulty with Google Chrome. That's because you can't use Google Chrome. So right off the bat, that's a good tip that might save you a little bit of frustration if you try to do some of the things that we're going to talk about today in your database. Okay, so let's dive in and let's talk about what is security groups and permissions. So security groups and permissions are basically how you decide who can do what in your database. Each user, that is a person who is able to log into your database, not to be confused with a client, which is any person in your database, but each user has a security group. And actually, when you add a user, and I'll go ahead and demonstrate this now. If I go to add user account, when you add a user, you have to give them a security group. You'll see this says this field is required. And this security group, whatever security group or groups that you put them in, will determine what they are able to do in the database. So that is how you manage who was able to do what in the database, so security groups and permissions. And it's sort of like a house. Like I always say with queries and reports, you sort of build the query first, which is the foundation, and then the report is the house. This is kind of the same with security groups and permissions. You make the security group first, which would be the foundation, and then the permissions will be like the house. So by default in your outcome tracker, one thing I do want to say before I move on to that is that this webinar and the guide that comes along with it, by the way, the handouts, if you want it, there's a handout section, and there should be a PDF in there, and it's the same exact PDF that's on screen right now. So if you want to follow along with that, you can do that. Also, I will be sending the PDF out to all outcome tracker admins, probably tomorrow or Friday, with this guide and the video that is this webinar, because this webinar is recording right now, and we'll send that out with the video. So this guide and this webinar, we're largely going to be talking about definitions, because the skill in editing security groups and permissions in outcome tracker is not in how you do it, because that's fairly simple. It's really more in knowing exactly what you're doing and what categories you're looking at and what they mean and all that. So moving permissions around is really simple. It's really more getting to know what you are doing exactly. That is the skill. Okay. So by default, you have a few security groups in your database, and it may be that you never need to expand past these security groups. They are designed to be pretty useful right out of the box, and so you may never need to expand further beyond this. But those default security groups are administrators, which is basically people who in your database who have access to absolutely everything. They can they have access to user data, account information, reporting, and the ability to add or delete anything at any level, and that includes adding other members to the database, giving other people access to the database. So that's a big one. Administrators have access to everything. I believe everybody in this call is most likely an administrator in their database. Advanced users are configured to have access to everything that the administrators have access to, with the exception that they cannot delete anything at any level and cannot add user accounts. Basic users are configured to have basic data entry level access. They can access user data and information, but they cannot delete it, can input data, but cannot see queries and reports, access to some, but not all tabs and client files. So those are pretty basic default security groups, and like I said, you may never need to expand beyond those, but if ever you do, we can talk about in this webinar exactly how you would do that. Okay, so one thing that you should, a caveat here, be careful, the interface when you're playing around with permissions in Outcome Tracker is unlike other interfaces in Outcome Tracker where you need to save your changes. In this interface, it saves your changes as you're making them. So it's just you have to be a little extra careful, because if you don't know exactly what you're doing, you could accidentally do something that is not undoable. So it's simple. You just have to make sure you know what you're moving around, so that if you move around the wrong thing, you can move it back when you're done, because you can't just navigate away from it and not save, and it'll be as if it never happened, because it saves everything that you do. It saves as you do it. Let's move on. I think let's talk about the different types of permissions. So I'm going to just go ahead and log and get into the interface for managing security groups and permissions. So if you have admin access, you have access to the setup tab. Once you log in, you want to go there, security groups and permissions. Let's click on that. And I will go to, I'll go to administrators, because that'll show me everything. Maybe I'll go to basic users so you can see the difference. Okay, so these are my security groups along the left here. You'll see we have quite a bit more beyond the basic. default ones. And then once you click on them, you'll see there's some tabs up here along the top, properties, membership, permissions. Pretty much everything you want to do is in permissions, but if you want to rename the user group, you do that here. If you want to edit the description, you do that here. If you want to see who's in the group, you can see who's in the group here. These are people who are available to be in the group. That is to say that everybody that is not currently in the group. Here on the left are people that are currently not in the group but can be. So if you want to add them, you can just do that here. And then permissions is largely where we will spend most of our times, most likely. Excuse me. So let's talk about the different fields here. So before we get too deep, I will say that largely probably if you do edit your securities and permissions, you will largely be editing in this category tabs and functions and this category names. And I'd say it'd probably be mostly tabs and functions and maybe occasionally in names. You likely won't be editing an activity or fields or documents, which you can see over here on the right. But I do want to briefly go through what these categories are. So activity you'll see here, there's all activity types. If we go over here on the left, we see the different kind of activity types. So you can set up different sorts of activity types in your database. This is not really a setting that ACWS uses to any degree. But if you wanted to, you could, the activities, which is to say these activities in the activities tab, you can see they all have different kinds of types. If you wanted to, you could restrict users' access to particular activities by assigning different types. And you can create new types if you want and use those to restrict people's access. Largely, ACWS doesn't use this as a setting, as I said, but you could if you wanted to. I think it's easier to achieve the same ends in different ways in this user face, which we can get into a little bit later, but that's activity. Fields is basically every question in the database. So you can see there's all kinds of subcategories here. Activities are basically any question that's related to an activity. And then enrollment pop-up is system questions. So we see enrollment begin date, stuff like that. And then this is all the questions in the database here if we go to questions. I will say you probably won't be using this very often. This is a very precise way to edit security users' permissions. And I'd say it's like doing it on expert mode. I have never used this, and so as an ACWS employee, I've never done securities and permissions this way. You certainly could if you wanted to, but I never have, and so probably you won't want to either, but maybe you will. But basically, you can restrict users access to particular questions. In my mind, if you wanted to restrict a person's access to particular questions, it'd be better to probably restrict them to the activity as a whole or to the tab that the activity is on in the user's file, which you would do in security tab and function, which we will talk about in a moment. Documents is, as many of you know, you can store documents on Outcome Tracker for your database. This is where you would give people access to upload or delete documents in the database if you wanted them to be able to do that. So that's pretty simple. You likely will want most people to be able to upload And by default, I believe most security groups have the ability to upload documents, but you likely only want users with admin privileges to be able to delete documents. That would make sense to me, but maybe there's other reasoning why you might want other people to have the ability to delete documents. But those permissions are granted in this section here. And then we have names, which would be actually more apt to call roles rather than names. I wish they would call it roles, because this is essentially where you access the permissions for roles. If you want clients to have access to people in some roles but not others, this is how you would do it. And then tab and function, well, maybe I'll explain now exactly how you would do that. So let's say this basic user, I want them to have access to anybody who is a residential adult. I would just simply select this and use this arrow over here to move it from available, which is to say these are all the permissions that this person has available to them but does not currently have, over here, and now they have it. And you'll see that it's turned into a little clock. That means it's saving it. So every time you make a change, it saves it automatically. But that's how you would do that. And then, and that's how you would add roles. And it's the same for anything. So if I wanted to give this person access to, right now they have access to all fields. But if I wanted to restrict that, I could take all fields off and then give them particular ones, maybe marital status. I would just move this over the same way. So it's the same in every category, how you add or remove permissions. But let's move on to tab and function. So these refer to these tabs up here. So basic users, probably you don't want to have access to the setup tab, which is where most of the higher level administrative tasks are available. You may want them to have access to reports. You may want them to have access to activities. And the enrollment pop-up, you probably want them to have access to the enrollment pop-up, because the enrollment pop-up is basically when you go to a person's file. Let's go to a person's file real quick. Let's go here. This is all fake data, by the way. It's not actual data, so I'm not like violating any security issues or anything. But when you go to enroll an activity and this pops up, this is the enrollment pop-up. And it's the same when you go to the activity list to check on the activities and click on it. That's the enrollment pop-up. So you probably want most people to have access to the enrollment pop-up, but just so you know. Also, name search, you probably want most people to have access to that. That's the ability to search for names in the database, which is pretty foundational to the ability to successfully enter data. And I will say probably most of what you will want to give people access to is under tab and function and people organizations. And these are all the tabs in your database. So ACWS uses tabs pretty heavily when it comes to data entry. And as a result, your database likely does too. And so when you want people to have access to some things and not others, you will likely do most of this in this area here. So if you wanted them to have access to outreach only, you would add the outreach tabs and then remove the residential tabs if they have access to them. They don't. They only have, or they do. They do have access to one, so we would just take that off. And then it's saving. So you can see that this is pretty powerful, and this is likely where most of your permissions editing will occur. So those are the categories in outcome tracker. We've got a few more things to talk about. I want to make sure that we discuss some tips and tricks and some best practices. But in a nutshell, that's how you edit security groups and permissions, and that is what the categories in the security groups and permissions mean. So I'm going to stop there and ask if there are any questions. So I'll just wait a few moments and let you type out your questions or raise your hand. Okay, it doesn't seem as if there's any questions. I'm going to assume that that means that I'm doing extremely well at explaining this. So if you do have any questions, you can just pop them in and let me know, and I'll try to answer them. So we're gonna just go over a few best practices. Like I said, the skill in editing usernames, or sorry, user privileges and permissions is not in how you do it, but what you're knowing exactly what you're doing, because it can be a little confusing, and I don't think that it is very self-evident by just looking at it. So it's really easy to add or remove permissions. You just select what you want to add and move them back and forth between the two columns here. The skill is in knowing exactly what you're doing. But there are a few best practices that I would like to share with you. And one of them is, in my experience, it is better to create a security permissions. Let's say, for example, you have one security group for residential and one security group for outreach that has all the permissions you need for residential in one and all the permissions you need for outreach in the other. And let's say you have a user you want to have access to both. They sort of straddle the line between the two programs. You could put this person in, you could put them in as a user group in two security groups, but in my experience, it is better for each user to have one security group. And that is, there are a few reasons why that is, which we can get into if you want to, but basically it's not a huge deal if a person is in more than one, but it can cause some confusion. So basically what I would do is, in that instance, I would create a new security group that's outreach and residential, and then add the permissions that I want from there. And that example, outreach and residential, is probably not going to make a huge difference, but there are some things that in which a person being in two security groups at the same time might cause a little bit of confusion. But that's just a simple example. In my experience, it's better to have a very specific security group for a person rather than have that person be in two that are trying to give that person everything that they need, because often it doesn't really end up being exactly what they need. So that's one sort of best practice. And let's see, there's a couple other things. Oh yes, you can restrict people's access to particular roles, but if you do, that can cause a bit of duplication in your database, because if I have, for instance, if I'm a basic user and I have access to only residential, and if I have access to only outreach and I go only the roles for outreach, and I go to search for a new person, type in their name, if they are, if they have the, if I only have access to outreach, but they have the role residential, even if they are in the database, they won't show up for me when I search for them because I don't have access to their role. So that can cause a bit of duplication. So you can use your roles. You can use roles to limit who has access to what, but I would actually just use tab and function so I would just give me access to, in this case, the basic users. I would give them access to all roles, and then make sure that they only have access to the tabs related to outreach, rather than only giving them access to the role of outreach. Because it can result in a little bit of duplication in your database if you do it the other way around. So that's just a little caveat, something that I wanted to make sure that you know when you're going into editing. We talked about how it saves automatically. This is some definitions about exactly what the subcategories mean. I don't think it's terribly useful to go through all of them on the. Oh yes, one thing that I find very useful when I'm playing around with when I'm editing security groups and permissions is if you have a user account available to add a test user account, like you see we have a few here for just testing security groups. So for instance, if I created a security group called residential and outreach, like we were discussing earlier, I could take this one, go to their permissions, and put them in the security group outreach and residential, take them out of the little baby security group, which is obviously a test security group as well, and then log in as them, so that since it's just a fake account, you probably have the username and password, log in as them after I made all the changes, just to ensure that what I was doing is having the intended effect, because you can misunderstand exactly what you're doing when you're editing security groups and permissions. I mean, I still do it, and I've done this quite a lot. I still sometimes don't quite hit the mark on the first time when I'm editing permissions. So it's really useful to have a test account that is a member in the security group that you're editing, and only that security group, that you can then, after you've made the edits, log in as, to make sure that you're doing the security groups in the correct way. So that is a little tip and trick that I find quite useful when I'm dealing with security groups and permissions. So just keep that in mind. If you have a free license available, you can use it to test security groups and permissions, which is quite useful. Oh yes, we should talk about all tabs. So I'm going to go back to security groups and permissions. Oh, I'm already here. Okay. So you'll see in each field, each category, there's an all. I guess not in documents, but in all the other ones, all fields. Let me shrink this one. All names, which is to say all roles, and all tabs and functions, all tabs and functions. So so let's go back to our residential outreach example. If like basic users only has access to outreach, if I create a new tab for outreach, if I create a new form, put that on a new tab and put it up, I have to remember that I have to give access to that tab to every security group who needs it. So for instance, if I create a new outreach tab, I need to remember to come back to this security group, search for the new tab, which it should show up here, and then give them access to it. Unless that security group has permissions to all tabs, I don't have to do that. If I give them permissions to all tabs, any new tabs I create will automatically show up for that security group. But if they don't have access to all tabs, I have to remember to go back and add them in. So that's just a little reminder. If you're creating new tabs and you want them to show up for particular security groups, unless that security group has access to all tabs, you have to remember to go back and make sure that you move it from available to the right, from the left to the right. So that is something to keep in mind. And you can give, what I would do in my database, which is what we do at ACWS. Although on the ACWS database, we don't really have a lot of people that aren't administrative, just because of the nature of the ACWS database, which is quite different from the way yours will function. But I would give any security group permission to all activities and all fields. I would make sure that they have permission to all those, and honestly, probably all names. So you don't really need to worry about those. And if I want them to upload or documents or whatever, then probably documents too. And then most, if not all, of the editing of security groups and permissions I would do in people organizations and under the tabs to make sure that they have access to the tabs that they should have access to and don't have access to the ones that they shouldn't. So administrators should have access to everything. So it should be all fields, all activities, all fields, all roles, and all tabs and functions. And then any security group that shouldn't have access to everything would be, in my opinion, although there are reasons why this might not be the case, so don't take this as gospel truth, probably you would do all activities, all fields, all names, and then only the tabs and functions that are relevant to that security group. Yeah, so that is another tip and trick that you can use to ensure that you are editing your security groups in a meaningful way. Is that you can give is just to remember that there's the access to all in every category, all types in every category. So that's a useful way to speed things up when you're editing security groups and permissions. Another little tip and trick is if you go to setup again, I'll do that. Oops. Go back here, go to setup again, and then go to manage user accounts. You can see here that you can see which users are members of which security groups. And yes, some of them have more than one, but that is mostly because they're fake. A lot of them are fake. But you can see security groups here. And let's say you wanted to know exactly who was in basic users. You could go through this list, and we don't have as many users as some of you probably do. So you can go through the list, basic user, basic user, basic user. It could take up a lot of time, but another thing you could do is go to the security groups and permissions interface by going back to setup. I'll just shut this down. Going back to setup, security groups and permissions, basic users, and then going to membership. That way we see right away everybody who is in this membership, and that is quite simple. An easy way to quickly gauge who is in what who is in what security group. And you can also assign them to the security group here or remove them from that security group if you want. So that is just a quick way to discover who is in what security groups. Another thing that you might realize when we're talking about permissions is that there's the full and view only up here at the top on the right hand side. View only are, you can see once it loads, there's nothing here. And that's because ACWS doesn't really use these settings here on view only, but basically you could give people access to fields but only to be able to view, or really anything in the database. It works best with questions or roles. You could give them access to the role, but only to be able to see who is in that role. But we don't really at ACWS use these settings. You certainly can, but I would say mostly probably your editing will take place on the full, which is to say that if you give them access to the role, they just have access to the role. They can do anything that a person who has access to the role would. They can more than just view it. They can edit it and save it and things like that. So if you want to experiment with the view only, you can, but it's not a setting that ACWS is used too often, which isn't to say that you won't find it useful. It's just, something to keep in mind. I find it's easier to edit to. I find it's easier to just give people the access that they need, and there aren't a lot of circumstances in which I find in which users will need to be able to look at something but not edit it all the time. There are instances in which you might want a person to be able to look at something but not edit it, like once it's saved or once it's submitted. Which in this case this would not actually be too useful for you, but you can manage that in form settings too. So, in my experience, it's better to find other ways to get to the same result, but there may be reasons why that makes more sense for you. And we talked about multiple security groups. So you see who's in a security group. I think that might be just about it. There are, I'm going to send this, the handout is available for you right now, and it goes more into detail on some of the definitions that are of the categories that are in the security group and permissions interface. So if you want to, we just sort of glanced over some of these because they're not terribly important, but if you want more information, then you can look at these. You can look at the handout, which is available to you, or else you can wait for the handout to come to all the outcome tracker administrators in the next 48 hours. It should come out. I'll send it out. But that is basically it. So I'm going to stop right now and ask if there are any questions, and we can maybe go over some of the questions you may have about security groups and permissions. So I'm just going to mute myself here and give you a few minutes to formulate any questions that you have. Okay, it doesn't seem like there are any more questions or any questions at all. So again, I'm just going to assume that this is because I'm just very good at explaining this very clearly. So I hope that you are able to understand and feel more confident and comfortable editing security groups and permissions. One thing I do want to make a note of is one of the reasons why I suggest making unique user groups, security groups for your users rather than putting them in 2 or more is because you don't have a limit on how many security groups you can have. You can have as many as you need. But one thing that means is that you really should be super clear about exactly what you're trying to accomplish with your security groups in the description. And that's sort of the same with reports. If you are vague in your report descriptions, it can become confusing about what exactly the report is trying to do and for what reason. So I advise you in both these instances when you are like, for example, with this one experiment with permissions group, obviously this is just an experiment, so it's not a huge deal, but I have no idea what this was trying to accomplish. So when you are creating security groups, as when you are creating reports, it's really useful to be very clear about exactly what you're trying to accomplish with a security group. And I think that's it. I think we can wrap it up there. There's no more questions. There will be a quick little survey when we're done. When you exit, a quick little survey about whether or not you learned anything from the webinar, how we did, and suggestions about what you might want to see in the future. So if you could fill that out, that would be really useful for us. And I hope that you learned something about security groups and permissions, and I hope you feel more comfortable editing your security groups and permissions. And of course, if you have any questions, you can always contact OT support at acws.ca, and I will try to answer your questions. And that includes if you're trying to edit your security groups and permissions. So just give that email a jingle, and I will try to get back to you as soon as possible. All right. I hope you all have a nice day. Thanks.